Thank you. Thank you all for coming out, especially on a Saturday evening, especially when the weather promised to be so inclement. I feared driving up Saturday night, poor weather, rain, mist, ice, snow. Surely no one will turn out for a lecture with such a dry as dust title as this one. But then, of course, I walked in. Beer, wine, cheese, grapes. Oh, they'll turn out. No, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you. I do have just one request, however, and that is, Brian, if your wife goes into labor during this lecture, I do claim credit. At least Gabriel Joseph is the name, but at least for a confirmation name, David. So even the people sitting with me were saying pressure. So it's a pleasure. I have a little epigraph that heads up this address, and it perhaps will be a little obscure right here at the outset, but I will refer to it later in the address. It's a short poem. You want a poem that you can remember? My God, don't you have enough stuff to remember? What you need is a poem that you can't remember in a moment of silence that you can't forget. That's Arvid Schulenberger. No one's ever heard of him. He happens to be an obscure favorite of mine. Let me begin then with a leap of faith. That is, your leap of faith in attending this evening. My topic, literature and the Christian imagination, is one that I would blame no one for being perplexed as to its supposed meaning. What in the dickens could that be? It could refer to a discussion of Christian authors of imaginative literature, of which there have been so many. It could refer to an overview of the history of Christian fiction and poetry, or it could even, help us, it could even refer to a knockdown, drag-out theological discussion of Hans Urs von Balthasar and Dante. You had no idea what you're going to get. So I'm afraid the title does you very little good, and in fact does even less good considering the organizers of this event were only made aware of the title late yesterday afternoon. Thus, there's something of a leap of faith in attending a talk like this at all, and so I must say you have my admiration. In fact, my purpose here is to make a few, very few really, but I believe quite important points about imaginative literature and by extension about its relation to an alert Christian mind. I will do so under the auspices, so to speak, of the great Catholic principle that grace perfects nature. In other words, because supernatural realities build upon and work alongside of natural realities, I will focus upon certain things about the nature of imaginative literature itself. This, in turn, will implicate or fold into some important relationships between literature and a Christian's awareness of or sensitivity to realities that rise above nature. But we will begin with ordinary, yet often quite forgotten things pertaining to the literature of this world, here and now. This will require drawing upon some quasi-philosophical terms or distinctions, but really, I don't think our discussion this evening need to be terribly systematic. The principles involved are broad and generous, and so too will be our discussion of them. These principles, however, are no less fundamental and important for all that. And so now to literature. I don't think it's a surprise to anyone that we live in a time of very great confusion about literature. Maybe this doesn't press upon people's minds in so political a season as this, but think about it. Very little is actually understood commonly with a cultural consensus about the value or nature of literature. We're hard-pressed to say what it is, harder pressed to say what it is for, and we are more than a little afraid, some of us anyway, that literature as an artifact of a pre-digital world may be doomed to merely fade away. When the value or importance of literature is described, we tend to rely on platitudes. They come in quick succession. Literature enlivens the mind, it elevates the soul, it teaches this or that, but we soon fall silent. Perhaps the first thing to do then, in shedding light on admittedly a perplexing subject, is to clear away some thickets of common contemporary misconception about literature. In other words, first let's talk about what literature is not. Misconception number one, literature is, and this is a misconception, literature is mere amusement, entertainment, a tool for killing time, a kind of solitaire with words instead of cards, a diversion or distraction, and as irrelevant to the life of the mind or to the soul as is one's taste in ice cream or Christmas cards. Okay, so in this season, one's taste in Christmas cards might be a little more consequential, but you get the idea. Clearly, literature can be taken up as nothing other than amusement. The lively sale of cheap novels at airports everywhere, and I mean that in every possible sense of the word cheap, is testimony to the near ubiquity, the everywhere-ness of texts meant for pure diversion. I mean, that's what they're doing in those airport stalls, aren't they? It's a kind of a legal drug to anesthetize you for the trip, for the airplane ride. You know, so that's really what those books are doing. No better example of literature as a meager means of distraction can be found. So, of course, literature may be approached and even composed in this way. However, entertainment as such is too ephemeral, too light, too insubstantial to have resulted in texts that endure and draw readers age after age. The epics of Homer and Virgil, the dramas of Sophocles and Shakespeare, the novels of Dostoevsky and Dickens, even the lyric poetry, say Wordsworth or Robert Herrick, these have been read and reread with an intensity of interest, and not just by professors, and not just on assignment, but by general readers intensely interested, and mere entertainment simply is inadequate to explain that fact. True, such texts are also entertaining, they're certainly pleasurable, but such literature can also be oddly vexing. Such literature can prompt thoughts and reflections well beyond the moment of their reading. It is as if they matter somehow beyond the bounds of the immediate experience of the pleasure of reading. So the literature as entertainment school of thought seems simply unreal, simply unequal to the actual phenomenon of texts and readers. However prominent, even dominant, literature as pure entertainment or diversion may be in our culture, that conception of literature will not do if we are looking for the heart or the essence of the thing. Misconception number two. Literature is a history of ideas in fictive or figurative disguise. It is a kind of intellectual burial ground where literary archaeology may excavate or study the past in order to determine what they back then thought, felt, or believed. Okay, well, that's a misconception, I think, but clearly it has a bit more heft to it. It's attractive, at least to college professors, I admit, and literature does indeed yield up to us all kinds of riches in the understanding of earlier cultures and eras. One can enter more deeply into the Greek mind, the Roman mind, the Hebrew mind, the medieval mind through literature, living thus within history and not simply reading about it. Granted. However, while literature can do this, it also does not seem to be what literature is. Few, if any, notable authors have actually written in order to trace the history of the ideas of their own day. More to the point, if this is at bottom what literature is, in other words, if we're at the heart of the thing, the capturing of a time's ideas and presuppositions, well then, in postmodern fashion, we have to expand the notion of literature to include anything that conveys something of the ideas that animate an age. In other words, architecture, educational practices, legal documents, even as is popular in our times, tabloids relating the misadventure of apparently talentless celebrities. All of these things become elevated as texts, because they are to be read in cool archaeological detachment. Again, something else certainly seems to be happening with literature, something well beyond scratching the itch of curiosity about the past. Well, misconception number 3, and this one may hurt, okay? It may sound as if I'm going to contradict a claim often made in support of serious literature, especially by Christians committed to good education. So if you have fruit, prepare to hurl it now. Misconception, I say, number 3. Literature is a series of moral lessons or inducements to moral behavior. Here too, I grant readily, in anticipation of flying fruit perhaps, I grant readily that literature may have precisely this effect. It may encourage, indeed, moral behavior, and it may embody a series of moral lessons. But this, again, does not seem to be what it is or what it is primarily for. First of all, if it were, frankly, I'm not sure its track record is all that remarkably good. The capacity of entire peoples to be steeped in great literature and yet sink into a moral morass should give us pause as to the power of literature to induce good behavior. Not too long ago, I was introduced to the writings of a man, Sir Patrick Leigh Fermor. I'm sure some of you probably are familiar with him. He passed away just a few years ago. He's a famous British author, a travel writer, a man of letters, and in World War II, he was a British Special Forces operative. He was a kind of behind-the-enemy lines spy. And the British, this pertains to my point, wait for it, the British placed Sir Patrick Leigh Fermor behind enemy lines, specifically on the island of Crete with a couple of companions, which island was under complete Nazi occupation at the time. Well, having nothing better to do, Patrick Leigh Fermor and his colleagues kidnapped the commanding Nazi officer of the entire island. Kidnapped him. This is General Karl Kreipe was his name, and spirited him away. But it took weeks. This I'm reading from the London Telegraph obituary for Fermor. For 3 weeks, the group evaded German search parties, finally marching the general over the top of Mount Ida, the mythical birthplace of Zeus. It was here that occurred one of the most celebrated incidents in the Leigh Fermor legend. Gazing up at the snowy peak, Kreipe recited the first line of Horace's, the Latin poet Horace's ode Ad Thaliarchum, and I will give it the classical pronunciation. Confessedly, I prefer the medieval, but Horace was not, so I'll read it in a Horatian fashion. Vides ut alta stet nive candidum soracte, which translates, see how Soracte stands white with snow on high. This is the German general reciting this line at the site of the mountain. Leigh Fermor immediately continued the poem in Latin to its conclusion. The two men realized they had drunk at the same fountains before the war, as Leigh Fermor put it, and things between them were very different from then on. It is said that the German general remarked that at least he was kidnapped by civilized men. Now this anecdote is charming, delightful even, but puts one in mind of a rather sobering fact. One of the best, think about this, one of the best educated, I'm not speaking of the general in particular now, but of the culture, one of the best educated, best read, classically schooled cultures in the world became Nazi Germany. It is entirely possible to be well read in literature and become a moral monster at the same time. Nevertheless, this misconception about literature being primarily a moral and didactic tool has had the odd result of you and I, being awash in a flood of contemporary children's literature, more relentlessly preachy and monotonous than any traditional schoolmarm's pointed finger could hope to have been. You have all seen these tiresome books. You know, the virtues of eco-sensitivity, the value of being nice to new neighbors, the sublime happiness of a family with 2 mommies or 2 daddies. The only consolation amidst this flood of didactic drivel, I may say, is that it usually fails to teach anything at all. Beyond the sphere of children's literature, however, one can also see that a great deal of the uniformity and the insistence characterizing what is now in our time called political correctness is wielded in our media arts as a result of the notion, rather, that these arts exist in order to teach lessons about moral, social, and political things. Some of the stridency that we see in public media discourse really is driven by the notion that it is the object of media arts to leverage culture in a certain way. So regardless of which side of the moral spectrum one is on, traditional morality or politically correct, progressive moral consciousness, a lot of us tend to regard literature and the arts in general as at heart means of leveraging our culture our way. There's this brings to mind a famous short story by Hector Hugh Munro. Some of you may know of him. He wrote under the pen name Saki. And one of his short stories, it's very short, I highly recommend it, is called The Storyteller. And it tells the story of a man in a 19th century, or at least turn of the 20th century, railway carriage sitting across from a young woman with her maybe 10-year-old daughter who was acting out, was misbehaving. And the woman was clearly at her wit's end and tried to amuse or entertain this daughter by telling her stories. And she kept telling her stories about good little children who were being good, and their goodness resulted in goodness, and goodness was everywhere. And this little girl is getting increasingly bumptious. Maybe it was a little boy, I forget. It's been some years. But at a certain point, finally, the young man sitting opposite them says, "Let me try." And he tells the story, and this is a spoiler, but the story is so delightfully told, it won't really spoil it. He says, once upon a time there was a little girl, lived in a village, and she was so good. And he said, the minute he says this little girl was so good, the 10-year-old sinks a little bit in the chair. She was so good, the storyteller says, that she received medals. In this town they gave little awards, medals, like Olympic gold medals for being good. And she amassed this massive collection of medals that were always around her neck. Well, one day she goes out in the woods, and sure enough, she is chased by a wolf. A hungry wolf sees her. That's Lunch walking down the path. So he gives her chase, and she runs and hides, and finally she succeeds in hiding from the wolf by diving into some shrubs. The wolf cannot find her. So she's breathing heavily in relief, but that same breathing makes all her goodness medals clink, which attracts the attention of the wolf, who comes and promptly devours her. All good stories end up with somebody being... Anyway, the woman, the mother, is horrified. The child was rapt, just utterly transfixed by the story. The mother is horrified, this terrible story, and she says, "How could you say such a thing?" And he says, "Well, at least it kept the child pacified for 10 minutes. So enough of misconception number 3. Lastly, and perhaps most importantly, misconception number 4. Literature is a sequence of secret themes and hidden ideas, cleverly concealed and embedded in texts in order to prompt a kind of hunt on the part of the reader. It is a shell game in which the author hides a pea and dares the reader to find it. This is perhaps one of the most important misconceptions, because it is the one that students today are almost universally schooled to believe. It used to be they were schooled to think that literature was moral indoctrination in disguise, though that led to certain difficulties with texts ranging from Aristophanes and Chaucer to Lawrence Sterne and Alice Thomas Ellis. But now the commonplace is the great theme hunt, a kind of mystery board game whereby students and readers aim to outfox the author, or at least follow the clues ingeniously placed by the author in order to arrive at that golden nugget, the hidden theme. Now, this is a difficulty indeed, because literature is possessed of themes, though in certain genres like lyric poetry, those themes are not always presentable in the form of a proposition. But the artistry and the craft of the author often does render a theme a matter of some delicacy in observing. I think we've all experienced that. So to read intelligently certainly does seem, at times, to be an act of adroit extraction of an author's central concerns. Nevertheless, this so-called shell game, the blame for which, alas, lies squarely on the shoulders of my own profession, is not of the essence of literature. Flannery O'Connor succinctly yet eloquently makes this very point. Some people, she writes, have the notion that you read the story and then climb out of it into the meaning. But for the fiction writer himself, I would say the literary author in general, the whole story is the meaning, because it is an experience, not an abstraction. I realize that a certain amount of this, what is the significance, has to go on, concedes O'Connor. But I think something has gone wrong in the process, when for so many students, the story becomes simply a problem to be solved, something you evaporate to get instant enlightenment. The meaning of a story, she observes, has to be embodied in it, has to be made concrete in it. A story is a way of saying something that can't be said any other way, and it takes every word in the story to say what that meaning is. Well, behind the apparently light and casual language O'Connor uses lies a serious and even metaphysically charged understanding of literature as a rich, created imitation of the rich, created reality or world. An alert Christian ear, so to speak, will pick up on the incarnationally suggestive reference to meaning as irreducibly embodied in literature. When O'Connor mentions in matter-of-fact simplicity that literature says things that can't be said any other way, a Christian reader might think of other things that resist easy formulation, like the bottomlessness of Scripture, or the strange luminosity and obscurity of creedal formulations, or the Nicene Creed, for instance, or the opening of St. John's Gospel. Her casual remarks are undergirded with a world of weighty suggestion about the nature of literature and its bearing upon the intersection of this world and the next. So now, of course, we are moving beyond misconceptions about literature, and we are beginning to touch on realities, what literature in fact is, and how it might shape and be shaped by a Christian imagination. So let us simply ask, what is literature for? Because that's a way of asking, what is it? If it's not a moral lesson, if it's not a hidden theme, if it's not a history of human thought, if not a convenient killer of time, well, what then? First, we need to acknowledge that it is in itself and properly not a means to some other thing. Notice what sometimes you found in all those misconceptions, the idea that it was a means to some other end. It is not, in other words, instrumental. It does not bear the relation to life that does a hammer or an insurance policy or an antihistamine or even a mint-flavored toothpick, good and necessary though such things may be. It is, I dare say it, an end in itself. It could be said to be its own end. It is something we do or engage in for its own sake, as an object in itself and quite apart from its salutary effects. It is a good that requires no additional justification other than its being a good to warrant its existence or our attachment to it. Like a flower garden that is simply beautiful, or health of the body that is simply desirable, or the glories of a Beethoven symphony, or the wonders of a mystic caught up in the contemplative beholding of God, literature, if it is any good, is a worthy end. Not surely as worthy as some other ends, and not without complicated ties to other facets of life, or even a good life, facets that will be an important point in these remarks tonight. But in itself, what literature is for is the inherent good. Note I say good and not merely pleasure. The inherent good experienced when a rational soul enters into apprehension of a created, intelligible, meaningful, formal excellence. And all I mean by formal excellence is a thing that has been given, intentionally been given a form, a genre, a shape, so that it may be apprehended and understood by others. As we will see, looking at literature as an end in itself turns out to be essential to a kind of paradox. That is, this thing, good in itself, is also productive of other ancillary, consequential goods as well. Good in itself, it becomes also the means to other goods. In fact, in this case, if it were not a good in itself, it could not be a proper means to some of these other goods. That is, if I may use an analogy, very attractive to college students, literature is like romance. This particular member of the opposite sex is certainly possessed of human dignity, is a good in and of herself. She is to be appreciated and honored as an end, not as a means to other ends or goods. But, lo and behold, once she is properly appreciated in and of herself as an inherently good thing, then comes a host of other ancillary goods, and the goods ancillary to that central one. She may, for instance, come to your rescue when your car has died on the freeway. She may prove useful in all kinds of ways. She may provide access to her world-class collection of Spanish zarzuelas. That's a short form of opera. She may provide good advice about this or that, or she may even provide children. And children are themselves inherent goods that also become the means to the end of other goods, like tax exemptions. I was joking earlier, I don't know if this came up at dinner, but I was joking earlier with some guests here that one of my sons was born 10 p.m. December 31st. 10 p.m. December 30th, and we were asked, so what's his name? And I said, tax exemption. As my wife says, I'm a very bad man. However, so what literature is for can be described with greater precision than merely saying it is its own end. When we push a bit on that encounter between a rational soul and something made with meaningful, formal excellence, things come into view that bear on the relation of literature to a robust Christian imagination. And we may begin simply with this. Literature is an object, an artifact, a thing made to afford what we might call an encounter with or an experience of mystery. By mystery, of course, I do not mean the detective variety. I mean rather those things about our experience that are most important to us, yet most elusive, most resistant to formulation in words and thought, and that can be encountered fully only in experience, even if that's a vicarious experience, rather than in abstract, propositional reasoning thought. This kind of mystery is understood experientially, or as the philosophers would say, connaturally. Thus, vicarious experience, a phrase too often used and thus too often dismissed for lack of understanding, accounts for the fictive or imaginative component of literature, the once upon a time, or now entertain conjecture of a time, or the pretense of reality that fiction engenders. This imaginative exercise presents us with experience, and thus is capable of comprehending what is finally too slippery and too deep to be caught in conventional, conceptual, or propositional terms. This is what O'Connor means by saying a story is a way of saying something that cannot be adequately articulated, can't be said, can't be understood properly any other way. Another famous storyteller and thinker, G.K. Chesterton, makes a similar point. He observes that the world is filled with mystery and that it is the work of literature to draw this mystery out and give it utterance. We are surrounded, he says, in this world by huge and anonymous forces. As they rush by us, we throw a name at them: love, death, destiny, remembrance. But the things themselves are infinitely vaster and more varied than the names. True artistic symbolism exists in order to provide another alphabet for the direct interpretation of these infinite and anarchic things than the alphabet of language. It is not that a sea at sunset represents sorrow, but that a sea at sunset represents a great deal of truth which is missed by the word sorrow. One can illustrate the point quite handily from any number of examples. The proposition or statement, the propositional rational statement, that the death of a loved one is sad or tragic or deeply felt loss, or that man's mortality is a terrible thing, is perfectly true and accurate. Yet the statements certainly fall utterly flat. They fail to embody the emotional complexity and metaphysical mystery of the thing to which they refer. They miss, in fact, the reality itself, despite their being literally correct. So what does literature do instead? It produces a real, albeit vicarious, experience of death itself. We experience death in a fashion, or at least mourning in a fashion. When we see King Lear, for instance, carry the murdered Cordelia, his daughter, onto the stage. No, no, no life. Why should a dog, a horse, a rat have life, and thou no breath at all? There, in that moment, is captured all the mystery of mortality and grief, the wonder and dread of death. How can a good as sovereign as this, Cordelia, lie so? How can what had been pure vitality and grace be a lifeless mockery of all that is admirable? It is the stunning absence of what had been so real a presence that Lear remarks in this short speech, in echo, by the way, of a number of other stunning absences in the play. And it is very much what people note, albeit haltingly, when they experience the death of a loved one. Another example, equally obvious, is found in some of the first words of that quintessential young romantic, Romeo, when he spies Juliet for the first time. A little bit more cheerful subject. Romeo says, "Oh, she doth teach the torches to burn bright. It seems she hangs upon the cheek of night like a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear, beauty too rich for use, for earth too dear." He says more, of course, though not as much as you might expect from a play thought to be the most luxurious of romances. But in this conceit, we find something beyond eloquent praise of feminine beauty. Although, by the way, that eloquent praise of feminine beauty is pretty damning for modern audiences. It is a very painful but important reality to point out to students that their own lexicon, their storehouse, for instance, for praise of members of the opposite is confined to 2 or 3 really clumsy, awkward, pretty banal things. You know, she's hot. She doth teach the torches to her bride is ever so much better. You know, no. This, by the way, this is why women should not be permitted to read Shakespeare. When they do, then the rest of us, we men have no hope of making an impression at all. But in this remark of Romeo's and Shakespeare's, we find again that an experience of wonder or mystery has been given form and utterance. In this instance, wonder at a sovereign good, beauty in particular. Though one doubtless not limited to beauty, it presents us with a vision that beholds more than sight would seem to be able of beholding. The limits of the faculty, so to speak, are exceeded, and sight, and it's important that sight is the most common metaphor for understanding and knowledge, is flooded beyond its capacity and the mind's capacity to grasp. This is Juliet. And we grasp through this experience of wonder something of the mystery of human love. Literature, thus, can bespeak those facets of our experience that bring what philosophers call discursive thought up short. It bespeaks what ought to be unformulable in something so flat-footed as language. What is most important to us is not actually realizable in abstract philosophical formulation. It needs the vicarious reenactment of story and verse to take on linguistic flesh, so to speak, and become a matter of our tellings. This is precisely the relationship between poetry, mystery, and ordinary discursive thought that is so artfully rendered in that short, strange epigraph I read from Schulenberger a few moments ago. The poet is telling someone who is asked for a memorable poem that he or she is really looking for the wrong thing. They're looking for a formula, some form of words that will sit comfortably in the memory and render its subject tame, manageable, safe, domesticated like a flamboyant tropical bird on a perch in a cage. They want a memorable poem to work like the discursive thought we give to the stuff of everyday life. Instead, the poet calls the person to a higher grasp of poetry as the thing to which we recur when confronted with awful mystery, mystery that silences us in that strange combination of fear and desire we experience in its presence. Poetry or literature may seem like the opposite of silence, but to speak myself half figuratively, it is the song we sing when we are out of our depth and ordinary talk trails off in mute inadequacy. And it turns out, good as all this is in itself, as promised, it results in many attendant goods or consequences as well. For our purposes today, we may say literature, in giving flesh to what otherwise cannot be spoken, also acts to tune the soul, priming it, so to speak, to recognize and receive the good and the true, sensitizing us to these things primarily through the attractive power of perfection or beauty. It was a medieval understanding of beauty as the attractive power of perfection. In other words, literature presents us not with concepts as much as it presents us with experiences that instruct structure from within us. As Plato spoke of music and gymnastic or harmonious movement, so too with literature. Poetry, as Plato would call it, forms the mental habits or imaginations so effectively that, as you recall, Plato was rather nervous about it. The subject is a complicated and endlessly vexed one, but a few things seem quite clear. In what is perhaps a paradox, life tends to imitate art. Again, literature tunes the soul, giving its faculties or operations a combined force and unifying its grasp of reality. It generates habits of noticing, as it were, and habits of feeling the force of this or that nature. More about this in a moment, but the odd thing may well be that literature has the power to shape our mental and imaginative habits in some ways, more effectively than does direct experience of the world. Unmediated experience, that is, direct experience of the world, the routine and unliterary course of our ordinary lives seems less potent, oddly, in forming associations of good and evil, of prompting recognitions of the moral character of what is happening about us than does literature. Why is this? How can the mediated experience, that is literature, be more potent in shaping our imaginations and more capable of sensitizing us to the moral force of reality than reality itself? Well, think about it. Unmediated experience is normally felt as a flood of nearly random, apparently chaotic sequences of events with equally accidental or unarranged distributions of insight or intense feeling or meaningful interaction. The peaks and valleys of concrete experience seem a careless jumble of what Thomas Hardy calls hap, or happenstance. A colleague recently told me how just after he proposed marriage to his beloved, an associate wandered into the room and asked if there were time for another beer before dinner. At the time, as experienced directly, this was just an irritating and meaningless juxtaposition of something sublime and something absurd or silly. But later, when he told the story, when it became a story in his own mind, when it became an indirect experience, thus, the meaning emerges. As Shakespeare might put it, the course of true love never did run smooth. This is what Aeneas means when he tells his beleaguered and exhausted fellow refugees, Forsan ete olim meminisse juabit. Someday, perhaps, we will remember this with delight. Apparent randomness characterizes much of the experienced texture of our lives. But literature lifts significance and order out of this apparent mess and presents it to us in arrangements of unity, proportion, and clarity, three things that, by the way, were considered the elements of beauty in the Middle Ages. Though literary or vicarious experience is still experience, it is rendered experience on steroids, as it were, at least potentially, by virtue of the ordering craft and wisdom of the author, or sometimes inspiration. This kind of experience then shapes the imagination or influences the way in which one understands the world, the kinds of meaning one tends to be more aware of in the world, those facets of things one tends to notice. It shapes the way things strike us as probable or not, likely or not. It influences what we find valuable or noble or attractive or not. If, for instance, Virgil's Aeneid has had a shaping influence on our imaginations, we are likely to recognize the sometimes grim but real nobility of self-sacrifice in the service of duty. If, on the other hand, the reigning influence is, say, Hemingway's Farewell to Arms, self-sacrifice will feel, as it were, rather different. It may sound like a stretch, but if our youthful imaginations have been shaped by, say, Robin Hood, the stories of Robin Hood, then we will not likely later have difficulty seeing and even admiring that really, think about it, that really strange combination of audacious courage and tender compassion for the poor found in the mendicant orders or in a St. Teresa of Calcutta. If instead we are primarily informed by cartoon versions of conflict or Hollywood depictions of kindness, then courage will tend to resonate with us as merely something military or martial, and kindness will be as thin as social justice and devoid of the fire of charity. Scripture is more than simply literature, of course, but if our imaginations have been shaped by Scripture, the picture of God as terribly just and oddly merciful will live in our imaginations. And in contrast, if the God in our hearts is the God of greeting cards, so to speak, fear and love of the Lord will disappear in a sea of divine niceness. The shaping influence of literature, good or bad, can enable or inhibit our ability to see real things and feel their moral force. Now, this is not to say that experience, actual or literary, alone determines such things absolutely or determinatively, or that man is nothing but a receptive blob of wax that takes whatever impressions experience places upon it. No, there are natural goods within and without that exercise their attractive power, but the molding and refining of our imaginations is much the result of experiences, especially the narrative and lyrical experiences that we have had. To bring beauty back into focus, highlight the attractive power and emotionally compelling facet of a thing, and it will draw admiration. Beauty naturally moves beholders. Obscure it, or conversely color some disordered thing with the appearance of beauty or emotional sympathy, and you will shape the moral imagination to be compelled and moved by broken, clouded things. Over the past few years, many have expressed surprise as to the rapidity with which some of our most fundamental and immemorial social institutions, the family, say, have undergone revolutionary upheaval. It is little surprise, however, when one pays attention to the shaping influences on the modern imagination exercised by our media arts over the last half century or so. Again, I'm not suggesting that in tuning the soul in this fashion, literature can be deployed to determine the moral character of a people. We have too much history of the world for that. But while good literature is no guarantee of right and proper moral and intellectual convictions, it does equip the mind to recognize the good, or at least recognize the moral or human weight, heft, import, or resonance of a moment, a situation, or a choice. It may not act as software that makes us perform in a certain way, but it does prepare us to see that something of great or comical or minuscule or paradoxical moment is before us. It teaches us to recognize the significance of events and choices, actions and consequences, and all those most important relationships that are immaterial and yet make up the difference between a good life and one that is unreflective and mute. As a friend of mine used to say, literature simply tells the truth. The relationship of literature to the Christian imagination is implicit, then, in virtually everything we've been discussing. Because it is its own end, it is not properly a tool, not properly, by which I mean primarily, a means to anything other than itself. This is because it is an image of reality, and thus, like the reality created by God, it is in itself good. To regard it principally as a means to something else is to make the same error we make in regarding other people as simply means to our own ends, or the beauty of a rose as simply a means of impressing someone, or the existence of a child as simply a means to free yard work and dishwashing, which, by the way, I can tell you doesn't work very well. Yes, roses are impressive, and children, yes, can sometimes be useful, and other people can occasionally help rather than interfere with what we are trying to do. But woe be unto him who thinks of all good things merely as means. It is a kind of sin against the Creator to fail to recognize the inherent good in things, and literature, by virtue of its imitative connection to God's creation, shares in its inherent value. More particularly, by virtue of its essential relation to beauty, as well as the truth of creation, literature is its own end, a good in and of itself. The Christian imagination, alert to the shadow or echo of God throughout the world, is quick to appreciate that echo in art and literature, even when God is not specifically mentioned. Paradoxically, as we have seen, it is the very inherent value of literature that makes it fruitful of other goods. As Blessed John Henry Newman says, good is not only good, but reproductive of good. This is one of its attributes. Nothing is excellent, beautiful, perfect, desirable for its own sake, but it overflows and spreads the likeness of itself all around it. Good is prolific. Thus, literature, good for its own sake, is also good for the articulation and understanding of some of the most important things about our lives and experience. It illuminates our understanding. We may not know how to define love or sorrow very deeply, but we understand it nonetheless, and by extension, learn to experience our own loves and sorrows more fully when we see these mysteries embodied and illuminated in good literature. Now, some people have mastered the art of, as it were, enjoying mystery merely on the level of wonder, and never following those wonders to where they might lead. But as even Plato and Aristotle knew, wonder is not meant to be static. It is meant to set us on a path of discovery. We may begin wondering at mysteries of this world, but the Christian imagination ends in the wonders and mysteries of the next. For the Christian imagination, alive to realities material and immaterial, mystery is a not so secret language that bespeaks the divine. So too, as good literature illuminates our minds, it helps tune or shape our desires and our passions. It teaches the heart, so to speak, rendering it susceptible to feeling what ought to be felt. It helps prepare us to be compelled by whatever is truly pitiable or admirable or lovable or detestable or delightful. The Christian imagination is one that responds in emotion and attraction or repulsion to the moral force or implications of real things and events. Literature helps inform and instruct this imagination and helps sustain that moral awareness in our lives, and helps sustain that moral awareness as our lives deepen in complexity, in ambiguity, and conflicting emotional experience. This latter point deserves a much deeper dive than there is time here to spend. We often assume, or we're prone, I think, to assume that the well-formed Christian imagination responds simply and instantly to experience. But this is not so. As experience is complex and multifaceted, so had better be the Christian imagination that undergoes it and sees its mysteries. But one of the fruits of literature, despite or rather because of its being a good in itself, remains this tuning of the soul or heart under its tutelage, a tuning frequently employed by our Lord in his recourse to parables. I will close with one last brief blessing attached to good literature, one especially relevant to the Christian imagination. Notice that the word imagination denotes something active, something in motion, something up to something. The imagination may receive impressions, but it moves with them and responds or conditions the response to them. Good literature is appreciated for its excellence, illuminates the mind, and helps tune the heart. But it also helps awaken us, and we need awakening. We live in a fallen and slumbering world. We tend to become dull, insensible, lumpish dolts. No one is immune. This dullness is a kind of, frankly, from a metaphysical point of view, this dullness is a kind of invitation to non-existence, an invitation that should horrify and appall any Christian imagination. We are meant to move, and literature is an alert. Author Annie Dillard makes this very point with an eloquence I will borrow to close. She says, "Why are we reading, if not in the hope of beauty laid bare, life heightened and its deepest mystery probed? Can the writer isolate and vivify all in experience that most deeply engages our intellects and our hearts? Why are we reading, if not in hope that the writer will magnify and dramatize our days, will illuminate and inspire us with wisdom, courage, and the possibility of meaningfulness, and will press upon our minds the deepest mysteries so that we may feel again their majesty and power? What do we ever know that is higher than that power which from time to time seizes our lives and reveals us startlingly to ourselves as creatures set down here, bewildered? Why does death so catch us by surprise? And why love? We still and always want waking. We should amass, half-dressed, in long lines like tribesmen and shake gourds at each other to wake up. Instead, we watch television and miss the show." I don't care to end on a dark note, but that note isn't actually dark. It, by reflection, as it were, illuminates what it is we do when we read, what it is literature is for, what it is literature is. With that, thank you. The problem is I'm a professor, so I talk for a living. And that means I'm very happy to go on for 4 or 5 hours. But let me answer in two parts. There is formal institutionalized education, schools and that sort of thing. And then there is that foundational education, that fundamental education that never really stops, and that is the education of the home, the family. I think one of the things, this will sound terribly provincial perhaps, I'm sorry for that, but in my own familial experience, one of the things that we have done that I think has had the deepest educational effect, by deep I don't necessarily, I'm not talking about catechesis, I'm not talking about matters of the faith, but it has had a kind of rippling effect across the texture of our ordinary lives, is simply a fairly severe, not absolute, but a fairly severe limitation on screen time. And this may be disappointing because it's a negative, it's not a positive, it's not what do you do instead. Simply by not having a television, or not watching television, or only having something that occasionally a movie or some special thing as a special treat will be seen, and not living in front of the computer screen, literally rationing that stuff, what that does is it creates a vacuum. And guess what fills the vacuum? Good literature. So you can work this again, I feel like a self-help book, right? But you can work wonders if you just fill your house with good books and throw out the tube. you can't call them tubes anymore. I guess they're just screens. But throw, or at least, put a quilt over the screen, and fill a house with good books. It was very interesting. There's a principle. There's actually an educational principle behind that, and that is people desire. What are you doing to fulfill desires? People desire good things. Desires are always oriented to a good. It just doesn't. It's not always a good thing that we use to attempt to satisfy desires. So I know, for instance, of a small boarding school that it was for boys only, but the small boarding school was started with the policy that no student, this was a high school, I'm sorry, a boys' high school, no student may have any electronic, musical, or recording or communication device at all. No cell phones, no radios, no computers, no televisions, no movies, no CD players, no iPods, whatever they're called, no recorded music, no recorded entertainment. And for the first two, so boys would go to the school. I know this because two of my sons went to the school, and for the first 2 weeks, everybody's kind of, in spasms of withdrawal. They're kind of huddled in corners, whimpering, asking for mountains to be dropped upon them. But after that, and I'm not exaggerating at all, they all learned to play games together because they didn't have the amusements, the electronic amusements, to satisfy that desire. They learned to play. They learned to play musical instruments. These boys would go into that school not knowing how to play any kind of instrument, and would come out knowing, a guitar or piano or what have you. You could bring musical instruments. If you had a trumpet, you could bring a trumpet, but you can't bring a CD player. Well, they also learn to sing. These are cool modern boys. We don't sing. We're too cool for that. I mean, these are really cool kids, right? Singing is something stupid and nerdy, and I'm too cool for that. Well, they all learn to love choral singing, the solos and everything else. And yes, they had good teachers, but frankly, it was the absence of things that led these natural human desires for goods like song and play and everything else to find an exercise. And so so speaking domestically, and I'll wrap this up very quickly. On the domestic side, I think in a funny way, if you fill a house with good books and tamp down the screens, the good is way out of proportion to the effort it required to achieve it. Now, institutionally, that's more complicated. But I will say this: I'm a hard-nosed educator. I believe in high standards. Whoever, by the way, says they believe in low standards. So I realize I just said nothing at all. Maybe we should. Anyway, I think that we don't ask enough of our students. I think our students are capable of thinking and learning and aspiring and desiring much more and much in things much higher than they often do. Having said that, I think there's a danger people who are educationally ambitious court. They court the danger of moving into a kind of, do you know Dickens' Hard Times? Do you remember Mr. Gradgrind? That is, there's a form of intensive, high-standard education that is a grad grind. Dickens captures this wonderfully. That is, it's soul-killing. It is really a transformation of the person into a database. Okay, we sometimes, usually in reaction against the zero standards of so much contemporary schooling, we err on the other side and become database managers, basically, where the database happens to have 2 legs and 2 arms. There is a principle in education that I think we too often forget, and forgive me for perhaps sounding sentimental. What is that kernel point about literature? It is a good in itself, and that good, how is it known as a good? The proper response to a good is delight. That is, We don't delight in things for the sake of delight. We delight in things for the sake of the good that is that thing, but the delight is our sign or indicator that the good has been encountered, okay? You don't go to heaven in order to have fun, but heaven, we assume, will be a delight because of the good that one encounters there, right? So the principle, a principle of learning, even in institutional contexts, really must be delight. That doesn't mean that all kids have to have fun all the time. I'm not mistaking fun education for recreation, et cetera, but a really superb teacher is one who knows how to woo students to take delight in the right things. Teach them what to love, and the learning takes care of itself. A colleague of mine at the college loves to say and he's speaking of college students, but I think on a slightly different level, it's still true all the way down to kindergarten. You can't really teach. You can just create the conditions in which people can learn. But it turns out people are made to learn. And their desires need to be nudged a little bit and crafted, but an excellent teacher is one who knows how to usher a child into the delight of the subject, whatever that subject is. So again, that will sound very sentimental, and I don't mean it to. In fact, schools can be places where my wife's grade school, for instance, was a place of incredible rigor, intensity, discipline, and order. And they were studying Latin in the 3rd grade, for crying out loud. And it was a place of delight. She remembers it more fondly than she remembers college. That's a good question. The last novel. See, I have this bad habit now. I've been reading more and more nonfiction, reading a lot of poetry and more nonfiction. But the last novel for delight was a novel. I actually mentioned her here. Alice Thomas Ellis is an author, English author. She died just a few years ago. Brilliant woman. Very, if you can imagine, a combination of Evelyn Waugh and Flannery O'Connor. Yeah, Waugh is right. That's a tough, hard-nosed, satirical, utterly steely, but wickedly funny writer. She wrote a novel. Actually, it's very timely. I highly recommend it. It's called The Inn at the Edge of the World. It's a short little novel. The premise of the novel is this. I'm not giving anything away. She imagines an island off the coast of Scotland, barren, almost unpopulated, and there's this inn at that island. The inn is dying. It's financially bankrupt. And as a last-ditch effort to try to float itself financially, it advertises in London that all those who are tired of Christmas, who don't want Christmas, should come to this inn at the edge of the world where they will not celebrate Christmas. So it's an interesting premise, and you can, and that's guaranteed to get a very interesting collection of people. And you get some who are just exhausted, some who are bittered, and some who are in mourning, and some who are, you get a very interesting collection of people, and the novel is their story for over Christmas. And I'm not giving anything away by saying the interesting thing about going someplace to avoid a festival is the way the festival haunts that going like a ghost. So just you try not to celebrate Christmas and see what happens. It's very good. She was a very keen woman when she was diagnosed with terminal cancer. She called up her literary agent and said, "Janet, I'm told I will have 6 months to live. Do you think that's a good career move?" This is about her own. She's really one. She also said had no sentimentality about her at all. She said, "Men love women. Women love children. Children love gerbils." there is no reciprocity. I warned Flannery O'Connor and Evelyn Waugh, no reciprocity, you know. She's delightful. So that was the last one. And so that was the novel, and you asked, what novel do I hope to read next? Well, this is very nerdy, but I want to get back into the 18th century. So I want to get back, 18th and early 19th, so I want to get back and read some Smollett. But that's kind of a nerdy sort of interest of my own. Yes, no, that's an excellent question. And the beauty of good literature is that there's so much of it about. Yes, it's probably on a scale outweighed by bad literature, but we've got a lot of history behind us and a lot of human experience pointing to things worth reading. And so there are books, there are lists that one can get of good literature. The best thing to do, though, is to ask a friend. Ask someone, what book would you suggest I read? And then there are a couple decisions to make. Do we mean novel? Do we mean poetry? Do we mean nonfiction? Nonfiction is actually a literary art form as well, although a little bit more rarefied. So where does one begin? The way to begin is get a few recommendations from people you know, whose judgment you have reason to trust, and then start sampling. And don't expect to like what they like best right off the bat. What will happen is you'll stumble upon an author or a book that you really like. So I'll make something up. Let's say Sir Walter Scott was prolific. He wrote a bazillion novels. So let's say you just reach out, grab Ivanhoe, and you read Ivanhoe. It's a famous novel, probably his most famous, and you love it. Well, you've got 30 other novels of his. So what you do is it's one of the few things where binging is recommended. I don't know if this explains anything about the character of my children, but my wife nursed. All of our children were nursed, and and you can't do a whole lot of other stuff when nursing, right? And she got through the entire corpus of Solzhenitsyn while nursing. So, I don't know if that had any effect on this, the temper or disposition of my children, but so yes, binging is good. So get some recommendations from people. I'm happy to talk to you afterwards and zero in on a few things, but get a few recommendations, just start sampling, and then when you hit something you like, this principle of delight comes into play. Then start reading more. And then what will happen, by the way, one quick word, your delights will expand and grow, okay? This is one of the great evils of teaching Shakespeare to students who are not ready for Shakespeare, is that they learn to hate Shakespeare, okay? The point is, there are things that they should be reading that prepare them to read Shakespeare, and then when they read Shakespeare, there's a way to read Shakespeare for the first time, and then that delight grows and expands, and eventually they're reading Shakespeare for pleasure and not because it's some blasted assignment from school. Do you see what I mean? So it's your delights will grow, will blossom. Delight is almost like a muscle. It becomes more potent and more capable as it is exercised. Okay, that's such a good question, and I'm very, very glad that that's come up. First of all, there is good literature being written now. I betrayed my own prejudices and biases by saying my next novel I aspire to read will be by Smollett. Say, oh, wow, I'm actually up to the 18th century. Wow. Next, if you see me again, I'll be wearing a powdered wig. Despite that bias or prejudice, yes, there are good things being written now. But your question really suggests literature for children. That is, are there good things being written now? And I'm sure there are. I am not well versed in contemporary children's literature, so I can't direct you to. I don't have a bunch of names to give you. But let me say something of import about children's literature in particular. I think this is true generally, but it is especially true of children's literature. There is value in the judgment of time. That is, books that have been read and loved by generations of children, maybe not a million generations, but more than one, say, have a kind of creditworthiness that the latest Newbery winner might not have. There was a kind of golden age in this country and in England, a kind of golden age of children's literature, the last 30 years of the 19th century and the first 30, 40 years of the 20th century. There was so much good children's literature produced of so high a quality, where the vocabulary is not impossible and not too antiquated to be understood. That is where I would direct people. I would say that start with something a little bit older, not completely antique, but a little bit older, still comprehensible on the part of the reader, but nevertheless that has stood the test of time. And then again, one can grow out from there. A quick point, a related point about lexicon and language. It's almost, children have remarkable memories, astounding capacities to memorize. I was recently shown a little video clip of my 3-year-old grandson reciting from memory in his halting and lisping way, Lewis Carroll's Jabberwocky, which begins, "'Twas brillig, in the slithy toes did gyre and gimble in the wave, did gyre and gimble in the wave, all mimsy where the border grows, and the mome's wrath outgrave." He didn't know what any of those words meant. I don't know what many of those words mean, okay? But there was a kind of rapture and joy in the mere texture of those sounds, of the versification itself was a delight. So in fact, really good writing is capable of hooking people, even if they're not quite up to the lexicon at use by the author. This is my way of encouraging people not to give up on not to give up on books that stretch people's vocabularies a little bit, that include words that are unfamiliar. And by the way, I'm not one of those who thinks that you ought to read with a dictionary by your side. I think one of the best ways to learn what words mean is to see how they're used in contexts. So you sort of pick up gradually what words mean by reading and reading and reading. So to come back to your question, I think with respect to adult literature, yes, there are good things, probably not as many as one could wish, but there are good authors and good things to read. Children's literature, I tend to have a bias towards something that's a couple of generations old or earlier, because it has passed a sort of test of time, and that's what you want for kids. You know, for children, you want something that is known, as it were, to be a reliable good. So I tend to err on that side.
One more round of applause.
Thank you, Brian.